This afternoon, it's my pleasure to be the moderator for the next session on change and reorganisation. My name is Ben Watson. I currently serve as the Director of Landforce Design in Army Headquarters. And I say we do a little bit more than just design. We look after Army's plans, both contingency plans and capability realisation plans. And our team is part of the DGFLW branch, and it's a great opportunity here to be supporting one of our other directorates in the branch. The after lunch lecture has negative connotations. After lunch, all of us are well rested, we've conversed with colleagues, and we somewhat often get a little tired. However, that's not going to be the case today. We're in for a real treat, rest assured. This will be a different experience. The next session on change and reorganisation, our chief speaks to the requirement for continual adaptation, the need for our Army to continuously adapt. Our three presenters, Lieutenant Colonel Luke Carroll, a reservist serving in Army Headquarters, and his presentation in Quintilian's shadow, will start our journey. This will then be followed by Dr. Justin Chadwick. Dr. Chadwick is an independent scholar, an Australian military historian who holds a PhD in history from the University of Adelaide. Dr. Chadwick's major works are the Atomic Division, which he will help us explore today through our Army's Pentropic Division experience. But another incredible work of his, which I commend to you, is the Sword and Baton series. Dr. Chadwick will be followed by Colonel Rich Bushby. Colonel Bushby is an empathetic and soft landing parachuting officer, and he'll take us through his work on educating an Army Australian doctrine in the development in South Vietnam. What all presenters will provide are unique insights into how Army has adapted in the past, both good and bad examples, and this can only help us consider how we achieve the Chief's direction. Change is the constant, as it always is, and understanding our past will always help to see the future. And this is indeed where Major General Smith's quote from Sir Winston Churchill comes to the fore. If we have adapted in the past and pay down the debts that the Chief noted this morning, then we must do our best to be prepared for a quick transition to an Army at war. And I would offer we must achieve this in part through continuous adaptation. And with that, Lieutenant Colonel Carroll.
Everything we do is in the shadow of what's come before us, relying on the records available of what we know or can determine through our analysis of evidence. The quest for professional mastery is not limited to the military. Every time, every discipline, organisation or society seeks, if not demands it, in its professionals. Over 2,000 years ago, the Roman educator Quintilian documented a model for the development of the perfect citizen orator, for my purposes, the optimal leader. Licence on my part perhaps, but Quintilian's emphasis on the blending of moral purpose with artistic skill, that is, on character and competence, resonates in the theme of our conference. This presentation will look at two waypoints, a generation apart, in Army's quest for professional mastery: the Regular Officer Development Committee, or RODC, and the Officer Professional Effectiveness Review, Army, or Project OPERA. I'll touch on similar matters for each, but when we get to OPERA, we're going to deep dive into execution using an artefact, a digital artefact, a now 24-year-old presentation. It's a time capsule that I'm going to use almost in toto because it covers a shared recommendation of both reviews. We'll need to do that at pace, but my hope is that those slides in particular will provide good fuel for question time. Let's begin. We've always been concerned about the character and competence of our officers. Our first 75 years, noting the tumult of two world wars and other conflicts up to Vietnam, essentially focused on junior leaders, particularly RMC Duntroon, created out of Kitchener's 1910 Memorandum on the Defence of Australia, and, in general terms, on addressing periodic but chronic officer shortages. The Vasey and Rowell committees of the 1940s were specifically focused on RMC, while the Wade Committee of 58-59 had broader scope for the production of all officers in the ARA. The 25-year middle lane on the slide, we've got the RODC through to opera and examples of the other things in between. The tumult around them continued, it simply had a different form. But there was a strong focus on education and the commencement of more deliberate development opportunities for senior officers. Over to the right-hand side of the slide, if you joined or have been connected with Army this century, you likely already know of them. They're indicative only. Their inclusion here is simply to emphasise that reviews and institutional questioning have a permanency that needs to be taken into our thinking and plans about the future. The RODC's terms of reference were signed off in September 1976 by Lieutenant General Arthur MacDonald. It was an army post-Vietnam, with funding constraints, changing strategic approach, the cessation of national service in 1972, reports and reviews including Hassett and Miller, and the 1973 Tang report and reforms leading to the creation of the department as we now know it and of the ADF in February 1976. The team was chaired by a brigadier and also had a colonel, 3 lieutenant colonels and a major as secretary, plus 4 part-time advisors who provided academic, management, methods and sociological expertise. Collectively, they were tasked to determine the military and civilian education qualifications and levels of training and experience regular officers needed to meet the requirements of Army and Defence positions, and to prepare a program that would satisfy those determinations. Whilst the anticipated program was to be limited to development up to the point of promotion to full colonel, they were to, and I quote, pay due regard to the likely avenues of employment to the highest levels above that rank, and they did so. They were given 12 months to report, which was later extended to 18 months. The committee felt that none of the various officer studies by Army over the preceding 30 years had terms of reference of comparable breadth nor enabled the freedom of action that they enjoyed. And they felt that this conferred on them wide individual and organisational support and enabled face-to-face contact with over half of the regular officers then serving. They delivered their report in May 1978 to a new CGS, General Dunstan, and it contained over 200 recommendations, 204 to be precise, focused on officer education, career management and officer employment. Particular key examples included matriculation as the minimum education standard for candidates for officer training, the gender integration of officer training, access to commissioning for married women, further study towards centralised career management, the cessation of promotion examinations, which many people were very grateful of, the creation of a framework of training courses from junior to senior rank, and staff streaming, which we'll return to shortly. OPERA was initiated by Frank Hickling in 1998. The preceding years had been characterised by defence-level efficiency reviews and initiatives, lots of them. Those serving at that time will remember these as lean years in which retention was a serious problem. Separately, the 1996 CGS's exercise had focused squarely on the future battlefield, assessing quality junior leadership as its envisaged most important success factor. This led to the following year's exercise being focused on the preparation of future leaders, particularly on officer education and training for the 21st century. The team was led by a reserve brigadier and had a full colonel, 1 lieutenant colonel and 1 major. Another major later completed critical foundational work on the career streaming concept. They had 3 tasks: examine the professional effectiveness of officers and establish the factors constraining their performance and influencing their motivation to remain in the service. Secondly, they would develop an understanding of what sort of officers were needed to lead the Army of the future. And thirdly, to develop a strategy for developing those officers. They were also guided by 6 principles from General Hickling: a focus on warfighting, continuous improvement of professional effectiveness, efficiency, that being that career management must maximise the Army's return on investment in its officers, full use of the nation's talent, integration of the ARA and the reserve, and structured and balanced careers. That is, that career management must balance the needs of the Army and the individual and recognise the demands of personal and family life. Their 2 reports, submitted to the Chief in '99, were subsequently considered by the CASAG, approved by the Chief, which comprised an Officer Professional Effectiveness Vision, or OPE vision, and an accompanying strategy. That occurred in April 2000, and the Chief directed it be implemented as soon as possible. The booklet you can see on the slide was prepared for wide distribution, outlining the way ahead, and was signed off on the 12th of October 2000 by the next Chief of Army, who was Lieutenant General Cosgrove, from mid-July. The lead initiative was to be career streaming. From September 2000 until the end of 2001, I was responsible for 2 of Opera's 5 initiatives. What follows is a presentation delivered to a substantial portion of the Officer Corps face-to-face, nationwide, in the first half of 2001 and remained available on the DOCOM website for several years thereafter. We emphasised that we were not delivering a project opera brief. That project was complete as at the end of 2000. We then spoke about the film The Matrix. It seems pretty lame now as I looked back over the notes in the presentation, but back then the film was futuristic, it was very popular and everyone had seen it. Keanu Reeves picking up a handset in the closing scene and saying something like, "I know you're out there, you're all afraid of change. I'm not going to tell you how this is going to finish, I'm going to tell you how it's going to begin." And we were much the same. We did not have all of the answers, so we were about informing how things would start. It wasn't about the end, it was about the beginning. The mission here was the informing the Officer Corps was essential because officers needed to know what this thing was, where it had come from, why it was being done, and how it would unfold. And most importantly, they needed to be able to situate it within the OPE vision that had been articulated by Opera and signed off by the Chief and CASAG. Purpose is taken straight from the mission. The method, background, objectives, we told them why. We told them or explained what was streaming. We spoke about the career review, gave them the timelines, and then covered off on other issues which were the anticipated FAQs that we'd encounter. The end state was a level of understanding which would enable implementation of the concept and contribute to its ongoing development. Now, in all of our touring, we didn't come across a single officer who didn't know something about Opera, no matter how small. That was the success of the Opera team who preceded us. Conversely, there were only a handful who knew much, if anything, about the RODC. And this was quite remarkable because the RODC had influenced everyone in every room, no matter what their length of service or whether they were full or part-time. We explained some of those influences, and particularly that of all the many and varied recommendations, probably the most important, which was not enacted, was grounded in these comments. The purpose of the quote was to emphasise that streaming was not new. Army had been down the path before. We'd gathered the evidence, done the analysis, made the recommendations, but for a range of reasons been unable to follow through on it. And when was this written? Of course, in 1978, which was well before most of the people in our audiences had even joined the Army. When it was all said and done, it was pretty difficult to find an excuse for not doing this. On to Opera. When General Hickling commissioned it in 1998, he was essentially after 3 things: reviewing the Officer Corps, determining future needs, and establishing how to get there. The Project Opera team identified a number of what they called key levers as a means of achieving the OPE vision. These needed to be both activated and integrated if Army was to achieve the OPE vision. Career streaming was seen to have a finger in pretty much all of the little pies, so when the time came for establishing priorities, it unfolded pretty much as follows. The first task was to initiate career streaming. This was endorsed by CASAG in April 2000, but the manning of 3 officers wasn't in place till January 2000. I'd arrived slightly earlier. An additional Prior 1 task was the development of the career review. This task was taken over from the Opera team as they signed out, semi-developed in late 2000. On the 2 flanks, if you like, were 2 priority 2 tasks. Up the top, TPME stood for Transitional Professional Military Education. And I quote from the time, "We already have many of the bits of this. Think of it in terms of your core and all core courses, JOPES, and opportunities for long-term schooling. But are we getting the most out of it all? This is essentially about achieving a more effective integration of the training and education that we already have, and in particular, for continuing the development of those officers who may not have the opportunity to attend Command and Staff College. Responsibility for TPME rested with Headquarters Training Command. Next was the Senior Leader Development Program, or SLDP. We also had bits of that already, Staff College and CDSS, but many of our peer armies had been investing more than we did. The UK Command and Staff College at that time was 2 years. The Canadians had never closed their Landforce's Staff College when they went joint, and also therefore invested 2 years of training compared to our 1. In the US, stronger performers had the opportunity to complete an additional year of advanced military studies, and many Australian officers who went to the US did that themselves. Responsibility for the SLDP was jointly shared by Commander Training Command and DG Purse. And finally, performance appraisal. Quoted from the time, some of you will be aware that a tri-service performance appraisal is in the wings. Army will probably commence using it next year. The sponsor is DOCOM. Understanding the model was important in allowing officers to situate the whole package within the vision. So let's look at the project. Career streaming had 4 objectives officially. Improved effectiveness, attraction and retention, rewarding career paths, and mutual ROI. There was also a final unofficial one. It seemed to be a synthesis of the others, and we had the opportunity to build a better system, or certainly to make more effective use of the one that we already had. The opera team believed that shifting the separation point by as little as 1 additional posting could have profound effect on the asset liability gap that was creating so much turbulence in the manning of officer billets. These bullets were elaborated in more detail, but in retrospect of most enduring importance, the status quo was a poor option. Balanced, considered use of specialisation would give us the opportunity to cope more effectively with increased complexity, and we knew from opera that many officers felt an irreconcilable mismatch between organisational and individual demands. Army hoped to provide more opportunity for officers to pursue their interests and talents in order to enhance organisational effectiveness and personal retention. In its simplest form or sense, streaming was about grouping jobs by function and professionalising them through a training and development regime, and Army already did that. The problem was essentially that we'd never taken our collective understanding much past saying that we had a regimental stream, a staff stream, or a training stream, so opera redefined them. There were 4, each with a number of specialisations, largely corps-based. Thus, the combat manoeuvre stream contained the combat corps. The operational support contained most of the logistic corps. Professional support was SSO-centric, so the only thing that was really in any way new was the formalisation of a military staff stream and the 4 specialisations within it. This is a global view of Army's job structure from the bottom up. The streams shown are groups of functional job specialisations because in organisational theory, a career was said to be characterised by 3 stages: early, middle and senior. Now, for most people in Army, the greenest part of their service is still the early career. This is where most of us spend most of our time working with soldiers in a unit environment. That wasn't going to change because that's where most of our grounding in the essentials of the organisation occurred. For that reason, the new specialisations would largely take effect in middle career. Some specialists would potentially reach full colonel or brigadier, though are unlikely to go beyond that level. Though in our staff checks, we encountered officers already there whose profile suggested that, but for want of a formalised approach, as suggested by the RODC, we would have considered them specialists without giving it a second thought. In 2001, I'll bypass it. In 2001, that's what each specialisation within military staff looked like. The important thing to remember was that it was all envisaged as commencing from middle career and had the requirement of both prior grounding and ongoing individual development. And this is how it was supposed to unfold. At Captain 5, officers would complete a career review. They'd reach a decision point where they would, basically one of 3 things would happen. Some would decide to leave, That already happened, but it could be better informed. Many others would simply decide to continue their careers pretty much the same, but again, better informed. The third alternative would see others move into a new specialisation. That didn't mean in staying there for good, because as a small army, our hierarchy of management, that being service need, individual development, personal preferences, hadn't changed. Various studies over the years had all been concerned about the potential to degreen and lose touch with the real army, so keeping a gate open was important. Towards the end of middle career came another career review zone. We were not fully decided on the form it would take, but the envisaged options ranged from a slightly longer than average interview to a variation of the initial package. But regardless, it would see the movement of some officers into senior command, and that is how the future strategic leadership of the Army would be built. We identified the jobs that we believe should belong in the new specialisations, and in terms of numbers it looked like this. The most important word on that slide being indicative. The figures were correct as at December 2000 and added up to just under 700 positions. In the mature system, we envisaged that between half to two-thirds of these would be occupied by specialists. They couldn't all be filled, otherwise opportunities for generalists would be inappropriately reduced. We analysed the MilPers specialisation in detail. We put it through an expert team process and workforce planning analysis, and then took it to the then DOCM for endorsement, which it received without amendment. This process led us to the realisation and identification that we needed something else, which was called a category construct. Basically, Cat 1 meant that the job required a specialist because it needed particular experience or education in order to be performed. An Army already had such jobs. Cat 2 were those that could be done by either a specialist or generalist, a good example being career advisors. And I quote, "In the future, your career advisor might be someone very much as it is now, for most a staff college graduate, or alternatively, it could be a specialist with advanced HR training who's filled that role for some years." Cat 3 jobs were included in the field but did not require advanced skills or training. So essentially they were grounding jobs, and most captain jobs across all categories were Cat 3. The career review was a great idea but too clunky. We found that there were a bunch of sources where any number of things where you could find books to sort your life out with. But the consistent weakness in everything was at the so-called most important part, the action plan. We came to the realisation almost accidentally that Army had a tailor-made action planning tool that we owned and all officers were familiar with. So the career review thus became an MAP-based self and career analysis package, specifically designed to lead to an individual development plan, and we targeted at the groups that you can see on the screen. Now, the remainder of this presentation basically covered off on how and when, what to do depending on which cohort you were in, and it had one caveat. There was a lot of work to do, a lot of integration with existing realities without upending the boat. In the front of the opera book, the Chief asks people to be patient for 2 to 3 years. We think it'll take longer. Everyone needs to realise that this is about an evolutionary change. And then there's a couple of slides to close it out for some observations. The RODC and opera were both of real importance to Army's journey. The training foundation laid by the former, for example, is what we took to East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan, regardless of what we now may think about it. The latter looked at Army's envisaged future needs and its then pressing retention issues and sought a way to address them in a challenging environment. The resulting work for both was complicated and needed more time and resources than were anticipated. Both rightly feared a loss of momentum. Invariably, initiatives that begin under one leader at any level, so I'm not just talking about the Chief or the Deputy Chief, it's at any level, will finish with another, perhaps several removed. And this will cascade all the way down and is difficult to future-proof. Post-opera, it became a problem at the working level. However, Army currently has around 260 mil-person CAPAC specialists. The Milstrat and policy specialisation was not continued, which in my opinion was a regrettable mistake. There's an officer in this room today who was one of those original Milstrat and policy specialists. However, to whatever extent the opportunity to specialise led to extended service over separation, Army did achieve a return on investment. I coincidentally know that of the 63 specialists who were serving in July 2004, at least 2 reached star rank and others became SES level officers in the public service. Army also now has 20 years plus experience to draw from if staff specialisation were to become a feature of the joint domain. And if we aren't already considering that, I'd respectfully suggest that perhaps we should be. Thank you.
Luke, thanks very much for a very insightful presentation. I'd now like to invite Dr. Chadwick up to the microphone.
I'd like to ask a quick question of everyone. Hands up and be honest if you've heard of the pentropic division experiment before. Right, that's not even half. So I think the statements this morning about the need to understand the past, that's indicative. But we'll fix that today. We'll know everything about pentropic, whether you like it or not. But I'd like to start off by looking at answering the couple of questions, which was what we'll be doing today, and what is the impetus to adopt the pentropic model? What was the implementation process? What was its effect on Army during the period when pentropic was in and immediately afterwards? And what were the longer-term effects on Army's performance? And what did Army learn, and what are the lessons for Army in the future? So let's start off with what was the impetus to adopt the pentropic model. The Korean War demonstrated the numerical superiority of communist forces and their impact on the battlefield. John Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State during the Eisenhower administration, wrote in 1954 that the free world could not match communist forces man for man and tank for tank at every point where they might attack. To offset this threat, a new strategy was necessary that utilised US assets, allowing the New Look policy to provide peace and security. Building on the National Security Policy Paper NSC 68, which argued for containment of the communist threat, atomic weapons would be an integral aspect of any new strategy. The tactical use of atomic weaponry offered greater flexibility and as a force multiplier. As early as 1949, retiring US General Jacob L. Devers stated that the efficiency of US ground forces would be increased if nuclear arms were not exclusively strategic weapons. A range of military and academic publications followed. With the Korean War over, there was pressure to reduce troop numbers from the US Defence Department. Chief of Staff General Matthew Ridgway was concerned that the Army in any future war would be outnumbered, thus requiring a force multiplier, and that atomic weapons should be included. While divisions' capabilities and firepower had increased, their mobility had not. To counter this, he proposed improvement in flexibility and mobility to reduce damage from atomic attack. These limitations were displayed during exercises in Germany, which recommended independent, dispersed battle groups. Concurrently, a study by senior officers, including General Maxwell Taylor, investigated reorganising division structure and tactics. On Taylor's appointment as Chief of Staff in 1954, he continued the study and argued that the old triangular division was outmoded. The outcome of this research was a new division structure called Atomic Field Army, or ATFA, better known as pentomic. The new divisional structure comprised 5, hence the pentagonal, pentomic concept, self-contained formations, labelled battle groups. Each of these groups consisted of 4 rifle companies, a mortar battery, and headquarters and support elements, with 2 battalions of artillery. The battle groups allowed greater depth and width than the traditional system, reducing targets during any atomic attack. Being more widely dispersed required improved communications equipment to allow proper command. Mobility was also increased through the use of armoured personnel carriers. The structure resulted in personnel reductions of 4,000 soldiers in each infantry division and 2,700 from an armoured division, thus complying with presidential demands. In 1956, the first unit converted to pentomic, with the remainder due by 1958. At this time, senior Australian Army commanders developed their own plans for a nuclear battlefield, On his return from a conference with Chief of Imperial General Staff in Britain, the Australian CGS, Lieutenant General Sir Sidney Rao, declared, "Army planning must be based on what will and might happen in atomic warfare." He publicly spoke of the need to disperse troops against nuclear damage, battlefield mobility to offset communications loss, resourcefulness in commanders of all grades, and simplification of administrative processes. Rao's replacement, Bomber Wells, agreed with the need for new doctrine, and in 1955 senior officers began training in atomic warfare. In May, the Minister for the Army, Josiah Francis, wrote to the Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, informing him of the newly devised concept and the changes tactical nuclear weapons would pose on the battlefield of the future. So what was the implementation process? Soon after this, a study group of senior officers with jungle warfare experience was assembled. The first such study to be undertaken by the Australian Army, the group was to design an organisation that would operate only in Southeast Asia against a numerically superior force, in which the regular army would act as a ready reaction force until the citizen military forces could be mobilised, have a high firepower ratio, and be able to operate in all terrains in Southeast Asia in conventional or nuclear war. The 1956 strategic basis for Australian defence policy reflected the new attitude. The opening of the policy paper was entitled Use of Nuclear Weapons, which noted that in any global war between the Western powers and the Soviet Union would use nuclear weapons. Identifying the necessity of coalition warfare, the paper noted the need for Australian forces to be armed with the most modern conventional weapons available, and any deployment would access nuclear weapons in the field under certain operational circumstances. The new Army structure, based on the US Army Pentropic system, was announced in the House of Representatives by the Minister for Defence, Athol Townley, in November 1959. The result was to have a force able to play a prompt and effective part with our allies in any hostilities in which we may become involved, and capable of operating with nuclear weapons. Alongside this pronouncement was the abolition of national service, with the funds redirected to the modernisation of the Army. Labelled Pentropic for its five-sided structure and replacement of the tropical establishment, the new organisation was specifically designed for use in tropical regions and consisted of 5 air-transportable infantry units. Infantry battalions of 5 companies of each 5 platoons were 50% larger than before, with twice the firepower. Support was provided by a reconnaissance squadron, an armoured regiment, 5 field regiments, a field engineer regiment, and a signals regiment, all called a combat support group. Armour was similar to the old armoured car regiment, but with increased personnel and equipment in each squadron's headquarters and the inclusion of a surveillance troop. APCs were added and an SAS company attached for reconnaissance and battlefield surveillance. New equipment was central to the revised structure. New vehicles, weapons and other equipment were selected to maximise mobility, especially by air. Firepower was to possess a nuclear potential. Vehicles and weapons were to be a simplified family that were compatible and standardised with US NATO types. Rifle companies were to be armed with an L1A1 SLR and M60 general purpose machine gun, both firing standard NATO 7.62 rounds. Armoured vehicles were to include Saladin and Saracen armoured cars, the Ferret scout car and the Centurion tank. Command was altered at all levels. At divisional level, the complexity of the system required additional staff and increased delegation. A deputy commander would contribute to policy and planning while also being a task force commander. Battalions were to be commanded by a full colonel with a lieutenant colonel as second in command. Platoon commanders relinquished control of support weapons. The new structure consisted of 3 types of groupings: battle, task force and combined teams. A battle group was a battalion with other services or arms attached. Each battle group would include a field artillery regiment, a field engineer squadron with aviation, and additional artillery added when required. Like a battle group, a task force was to have no fixed composition, but organised to achieve particular tasks, typically based on 2 or more battalions, but could be an infantry battalion and an armoured regiment. The task force was commanded by either direct divisional control or run as independent missions. Although there were nominal changes, the principles of handling a headquarters and for grouping within a division have not changed, rather increased in flexibility. So what was the effect on Army during the Pentropic period and afterwards? Following the introduction of the Pentropic Division, major exercises were held to familiarise members of the Army. A CGS exercise was held at Royal Military College, Duntroon in August 1961, involving nearly 150 senior officers from all services. Delegates from the US, Britain and New Zealand attended to observe the new equipment that was either in use or soon to be. A further 3 CGS exercises were held, as were 3 field exercises: Icebreaker, Nutcracker and Sky High. Operational Nutcracker involved 8,000 soldiers, included a task force of 2 battle groups supported by armour and CMF troops. Operation Sky High included airborne infantry aboard Iroquois helicopters and simulated casualty evacuation, with local troops being joined by 600 British soldiers. At the end of June 1962, Army comments on Pentropic stated that, though new and different from any other national field force organisation, it was classified as basically sound. Some officers, such as Alan Morrison, as GSO2 and XO of 1RAA between 1962 and 1964, noted that while initially difficult, once understood, the Pentropic system was simple. The 5-company structure allowed a reserve which could be utilised as an exploitation force and provide better echelon protection. The reorganisation significantly impacted the citizen military forces. To comply with the new Pentropic structure, CMS units were merged or disbanded, causing discontent among citizen soldiers, with many becoming surplus to establishment. This move saw the removal of old units that had served with distinction in both World Wars. Despite the new regiments being given the prefix Royal, for some CMF officers, the designation failed to offset the belief that regular Army officers desired the demise of the CMF. However, the CMF did benefit from better equipment and greater integration with the regular Army. The Pentropic division proved to be divisive. Arguments against the system included the abandonment of the Pentropic Division by the US Army, non-standardisation with Allied forces, Pentropic was unwieldy and therefore difficult to command, Australia should be aligned with Allied powers, and that the old system worked. Pentropic also reduced personnel in command, administration and training. The CGS at the time, Lieutenant General Reginald Pollard, noted that cuts were applied arbitrarily instead of through a thorough examination and analysis. Some cuts were seen as excessive, which resulted in overloading of staff and delays in administrative procedures. Throughout 1964, the Australian Army Journal published the ongoing debate. The Directorate of Military Training, unsurprisingly, argued the benefits of the Pentropic in the article King of the Jungle or Paper Tiger, pointing out that the changes that were made were essential and inevitable, and that though they were imperfections, they were neither great nor insurmountable. CRA of 3rd Division, Brigadier Dick Eason, responded with credulity. He claimed that Pentropic lacked battle know-how and was a paper Tarzan, and like all wild creatures of the jungle, he will be hard to command and lacking in stamina. Not a fan. Colonel CMI Sandy Pearson, CO of 1RAR, and William Morrow, CO of 3RAR, opposed Eason's views, particularly regarding unwieldy commands, arguing that until it would be better for those who had a good fortune to serve in it to try and understand it, rather than to simply criticise. However, there are other significant problems. Platoon commanders, usually young and inexperienced, were required to command a larger formation, And of greater significance was the need to reorganise along British lines when troops were sent to Malaya as part of the British Commonwealth Far East Strategic Reserve. This meant there were two systems in place concurrently. One major critic of Pentropic was the new CGS Lieutenant General Sir John Wilton. Wilton, who later said that the change was unwise, could not be properly tested, called for a review in October 1964. Delivered the following month, the Anderson Report, named after the leader of the review, Major General John Anderson, recommended abandonment of Pentropic and a return to the earlier triangular structure, but with the addition of aviation. Approved by the Military Board in December and Cabinet in January 1965, Wilton recalled later that it was the quickest decision I managed to get taken by government in my time as CGS. The Tropical Warfare Establishment replaced Pentropic and proved to be timely. By the end of 1964, the Australian government learnt of the likelihood of US troops being deployed in South Vietnam and the call for assistance by local allies. Before Parliament in April 1965, the Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced the US request for military assistance and commitment and committed an infantry battalion to support them. So what did Army learn? Pentropic was a profound change in divisional structure. By the mid-1960s, it was clear that the concept had not been accepted by all senior officers and was doomed on the appointment of Wilton as CGS. Retrospectively, it is simple to see the folly of Pentropic, but with any fundamental alteration, lessons can be learned. There is certainly a history of reform within Army. At Federation, the creation of Commonwealth forces, local militia units, some, the playthings of the wealthy, were merged into one force. More recently were RMA and Army 2.0. Each reform was a reaction to altered circumstances, such as technological, economic and strategic. Each had the best intentions when introduced, were thought of as being the best option at the time, and were the outcome of considerable deliberation. What all of these changes teach us is that nothing remains static. Change is inevitable. Change heralds disruption, but also opportunity. With this in mind, Army, like all organisations, needs to be proactive in its change. Constant analysis provides decision makers with data to inform future projects and reduces the possibility of a reactionary policy, which is often costly in implementation and compromised in suitability. Organisational change should reflect the current environment. As the 1956 strategic basis of Australian defence policy has demonstrated, planning is an essential, albeit unreliable, necessity. Defence planners took seriously the likelihood of the tactical use of nuclear weapons. Rowell and Wells, both veterans of 2 world wars, understood the altered strategic landscape. Their experience, both of war and peacetime armies, certainly influenced their decision-making. The need for closer cooperation with Allied forces, especially the US, was important in any Cold War conflict, as was demonstrated in Korea. Pentropic drew from the US pentomic concept, the idea that technical nuclear weapons would be part of a future battlefield and Army needed to modernise arms and equipment. Change needs to come from the external environment, strategic vision, organisational culture, structural processes and include feedback. External factors can be assessed with PESTLE, P-E-S-T-L-E, political, economic, social, technological, legal and environmental frameworks. Strategic vision requires alignment with organisational goals within extant circumstances. Organisational culture needs to be flexible and innovative. Structural processes may need adaptation to embrace external trends. A continuous feedback loop provides organisational evolution as external environmental changes. Any change should be implemented quickly to ensure suitability. When changes are required, they need to be introduced quickly and efficiently. The identification of problems, analysis and solution should be treated always as priorities. Of course, the size of the problem will dictate timeframes and outcomes. However, an infrastructure and culture of haste would be beneficial for timely results. Big change has the possibility to alienate, so needs to be conducted with care. While there is an inevitability of change, there is a common resistance to it. In the example of Pentropic, there were significant numbers of detractors. This was particularly evident with a CMF. Impact on all stakeholders requires analysis, particularly the greater the alteration. People within any organisation need to understand the reasons for change. Greater agency will result in better outcomes. Communication is vital. One aspect that Pentropic got right was the identification of the need to communicate changes. The creation of a public relations department aimed to disseminate the concept and how it would affect those involved. The Australian Army Journal proved to be an important part of this communication. Officers such as Pearson and Morrow used their positions to advocate for the new structure. Today, communications channels are more varied and permit increased dissemination of information. However, direct education remains possibly the most ideal method of knowledge transfer and understanding. Revolution or reform. While change is inevitable, the degree of change needs to be calculated. Revolution, the idea of significant disruptive change, is useful when reform is ineffective or dramatic change is required rapidly. While revolution overthrows the existing system quickly, the damage to participants and structures can cause difficulties. Reform, however, can be incremental, allowing for gradual change that is more easily embraced by participants. While it retains institutional knowledge, reform can be too slow, dependent on environmental circumstances. Which is best will depend on organisational requirements and the speed of implementation. Finally, the Pentropic divisional structure has been described as the most radical attempt at a reorganisation of the Australian Army in the 20th century. Despite the best of intentions, the resulting structure was unwieldy and inflexible, with excessive reliance on combat support elements to provide the needs of policy planners. The eventual rejection of Pentropic was seen as a wasteful experiment by many senior officers, particularly CGS Wilton. However, the process forced Army to investigate and analyse all aspects of the organisation that resulted in improvements and valuable recommendations. The acceptance of divisional structures similar to the US Army was indicative of the necessity for coalition warfare. However, these positive aspects of the restructure were offset by the disadvantages and confusion resultant of the changes, especially within the CMF. The Pentropic failure was highlighted by the fact that it would not work within either the British or US structures of the early 1960s and its rapid abandonment after the Anderson report. While the intention was sound, the result was too late and inappropriate for the demands of the Army and its operational needs of the 1960s. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Chadwick. Many prudent lessons that resonate for those in senior positions today. Our next lecturer is from Colonel Richard Bushby.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. This paper concerns the adaptation of the Australian Army's tactical doctrine during the Vietnam War. Over the approximately 6.5 years of the Australian Army's major commitment to Vietnam, the Army changed its operational methods quickly and repeatedly in order to respond to the circumstances it faced in battle. How it achieved this, and in particular how it identified, transmitted and then integrated the lessons it drew from operations, showcased the organisation's deep professionalism. Professor Roger Spiller, although writing about the US Army, could easily have described the Australian Army of the mid-1960s when he noted that military doctrines, fighting doctrines, have always been an expression of their time and place, an artefact in the mental life of a fighting organisation. Any armed force operates in accordance with its conception of war that has been formed as a consequence of its history, the state of military knowledge available at the time, the material and technical assets at hand, the objectives to which the force expects to be committed, and certainly, not least, the calibre of the people who must attempt to give it life in battle. All of those factors listed above are apparent in an examination of the Australian Army's tactical doctrine before and during the Vietnam War. The Army's experience in Vietnam provides a compelling example of how doctrine of this kind is applied, adapted and refined in the face of battle. Paper explores how the Army learned and demonstrated its professionalism during the Vietnam War through three interconnected themes. The presence of formal and informal learning systems that transmitted thinking and knowledge throughout the force, the impact of operational experience and the Army's operational concepts and its understanding of how it would fight, and the role of personal study and professional engagement in preparing leaders for the challenges of battle. Doctrine provides the structure for military learning, but the experience of Vietnam demonstrates that it evolves through multiple channels, through both formal and informal learning systems. And what distinguishes the Army of this period was the vitality of its informal learning systems, the sharing of experience between rotations, insights captured in after-action reviews, and the practical innovations produced by officers and NCOs in the field compensated for doctrinal gaps and became central to how the Army identified itself as a learning organisation. The Australian Army entered Vietnam with doctrine shaped by decades of operational experience, from the Second World War through Korea, Malaya and Borneo. It was also shaped by the fighting concepts that Army, as an institution in Canberra, and forward deployed elements developed in order to inform training, equipment, procurement and organisational structures. Yet the transition to Vietnam required these familiar techniques to be adapted to suit new terrain, new enemy capabilities and the operational preferences of a much larger coalition partner. The friction between inherited concepts and operational reality formed the crucible through which new fighting methods would emerge. And finally, personal study and engagement underlied all of this process. In the Australian context, for a small army operating within a larger coalition, this intellectual flexibility was essential. Personal study, professional reading and active reflection were hallmarks of the Army of the 1960s. Their willingness to analyse operations, challenge assumptions and revise tactics ensured that doctrine remained dynamic and responsive. This section will explore these themes in more detail through three key sections. Firstly, I'll examine the key Vietnam War foundations that shaped the Army's approach to operations leading into Vietnam. I'll examine the doctrinal recalibration that was forced by the 1RAR deployment over the period 1965-1966, and then the professional maturity reached by the Vietnam War, or reached by the Australian Army during the period of the Vietnamisation period between 1969 and 1971. The Australian Army entered Vietnam with a doctrinal inheritance shaped by more than 2 decades of operational experience, conceptual reflection and alliance influences. These shaping forces from the Second World War through the Malayan Emergency, Southeast Area Treaty Organisation commitments by 28th Commonwealth Brigade and Indonesian confrontation formed the intellectual and practical foundations for what the Australian Army came to understand as counter-revolutionary warfare. The Army's doctrinal development began during the Second World War, when isolation in the Pacific forced Australian forces to innovate independently. Australian units developed a distinctive small unit fighting culture, decentralised, adaptive and suited to close terrain. These characteristics would naturally align later with counterinsurgency warfare. The Korean War was a conventional conflict in rugged, mountainous terrain that contributed little to the subsequent development of counter-revolutionary warfare concepts. Despite this, the Korean War served as the first real operational experience for many of the commanders who would later lead battalions in the Vietnam War. It reinforced the importance of small unit operations, the role of junior leaders at the section, platoon and company level, as well as giving a new generation of commanders their first experience in the application of adaptation of tactical doctrine. They gained first-hand experience in changes to tactics, staff procedures, unit establishments and sub-unit employment that characterised the dynamic process of tactical developments by units at war. When this is compared with the processes of tactical development during the Vietnam War, it's clear that Korea provided the first layer of what would subsequently become the most thoroughly comprehensive and varied range of operational experiences ever to be taken to war by the Australian Army. The outbreak of the Malayan Emergency in 1948 and the subsequent deployment of Australian forces from 1955 reinvigorated the Army's focus on jungle warfare and introduced it to a style of warfare that came to become understood as counterinsurgency tactics. It revived the Australian Army's jungle warfare experiences and added new depth and new experience through the application of British tactical methods. It allowed the Australians to develop their own experience of this type of warfare, and this experience was subsequently combined with close observation and reporting on foreign conflicts by Australian officers that led to a deep interest in and wide professional knowledge of counter-revolutionary warfare. It also reinforced the value of population security, disciplined patrolling, integrated civil-military efforts, but it also brought risks. The enemy in Malaya was lightly equipped and rarely aggressive, producing tactical habits that underestimated the intensity of future conflicts. These strengths, and also these blind spots, carried directly into the army that deployed to Vietnam. Malaya provided the army's first experience of combating an insurgent enemy, but many techniques that were employed there were relevant only to the experience of Malaya. In particular, the quantities of fire support available and the accuracy of that fire support, relatively limited access to aviation support, relatively limited access to combined arms support, and the limited intensity of the enemy all provided a perspective on what was understood to be counter-revolutionary warfare that in some respects sustained the army positively over the next 10 years, but in other respects led to dangerous complacency on the part of some sections of the army. Operational experience was also complemented by doctrinal and conceptual development within the Command and Staff 28th Commonwealth Brigade, forward deployed into Malaya, and the Directorate of Military Training and the Directorate of Military Operations and Plans in Army Headquarters. Each of these organisations produced papers and doctrinal pamphlets that would shape operational thinking that later influenced operations in South Vietnam. These formal publications were complemented by personal observations based on extended observation and study tours and Allied lessons learnt that all combined to form a comprehensive but often fragmented picture of what operational requirements in South Vietnam would later require. Thus, by 1965, the Army had produced the Division in Battle series of pamphlets that reflected the Army's official doctrine, and its pamphlet 11, Counter-Revolutionary Warfare, was the pamphlet most relevant to operations in Vietnam. It was accompanied by companion documents, patrolling and tracking, and ambush and counter-ambush that laid the basis for the types of operations that the Army would subsequently take on operations into Vietnam. When 1RAR arrived in Vietnam, its doctrine and training was deeply influenced by these pre-war experiences. These assumptions were grounded historically by the Australian preference for small unit patrolling, close control, and population-centric operations shaped by the reality of a small army with limited resources. This deployment placed the Australian forces under the control of the US 173rd Airborne Brigade, exposing them to a new style of operational tempo, new volume and technology of enablers, and a coalition partner whose operational philosophy often conflicted with their own. American doctrine of that period emphasised large-scale search and destroy operations, rapid helicopter insertions, aggressive pursuit, and the overwhelming employment of firepower. The contrast between these two styles was sharp. What followed was a rapid and impressive cycle of adaptation at both battalion and subunit levels. Informal and formal learning systems, both bottom-up and top-down, refined the process of how the Army would learn to fight. Helicopters provided the Army's primary method of mobility. While not new to the Australian Army, the employment of helicopters in Vietnam was on a scale never before witnessed in Australia. In order to facilitate smooth, well-drilled air-mobile operations, the battalion had to develop emplaning and deplaning drills, landing zone rally procedures, refine its understanding of how to employ indirect fire support and offensive fire support in LZ preparation, develop effective command and control and liaison procedures, all of which allowed commanders to make best use of the flexibility inherent in the volume of helicopters that operations alongside the Americans provided. This was not such a problem for soldiers and officers at the junior level on the ground, but provided to be a major consideration for staff planners, becoming a contributing factor for the introduction and refinement of the battalion operations officer and operational staff procedures at task force and battalion level, and replacement of the adjutant as the battalion commander's principal operations staff officer. Initially, Australian forces struggled to navigate the complexity of US artillery and air support arrangements. Communications channels were unfamiliar, clearance processes intricate, and the sheer volume of firepower overwhelmed the battalion's processes for fire control and coordination. Through experience, 1RAR established its own fire control procedures, refined its understanding of artillery and air support C2, and learned how to plan for and integrate the wide variety of US assets available for Australian operations, and command, occupy and operate from large US fire support bases. The specific example of Operation Crimp marked 1RAR's first exposure to the Viet Cong's elaborate tunnel system. Lacking any practical experience in subterranean warfare, Australian sappers improvised, often at great personal risk. Through trial and error, they developed practical techniques for clearing and rendering safe and destroying tunnel complexes. This is an excellent example of doctrinal evolution in action. It was marked by no pre-existing instructions, no fixed answers, and a requirement for rapid grassroots learning. These lessons would later be codified formally at the School of Military Engineering, demonstrating how informal learning rapidly becomes formal doctrine, a central theme of this paper. Such differences in operating methods and tactics as existed were simply concrete expressions of a much higher level divergence of perspectives on how the war should be conducted. The situation which had existed when troop placements were originally agreed to was based on the American enclave strategy, which envisaged controlled base areas such as Bien Hoa gradually being extended to meet up with other expanded controlled areas. This had obvious analogies with the expanding white area, black area strategy that had been successful in Malaya and with which the Australian Defence Establishment, in particular the Army, were familiar. By the time 1RAR arrived and had conducted its initial operations, this strategy had given way to General William Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy. It was upon that approach that the battalion's short duration, widely dispersed operational pattern would be based. It demonstrated the degree to which Australian operational methods had diverged from those of the United States. And while minor tactical methods could usually be reconciled sufficiently to permit effective operational performance, Australian principles on the conduct of counter-revolutionary warfare, such as population control and civic action, were not easily adapted to fit in with American higher strategy for the prosecution of the war. It was partly this discomfort and the desire to find a way to prosecute the war in line with Australian national preferences and operating methods that persuaded the government and the Army to push for an expanded Australian commitment. The deployment of the 1st Australian Task Force, specifically, was designed to give freedom of action to operate in accordance with national preferences as a result. 1RAR's year under US command highlighted the decisive role of individual intellect and professionalism. On return to Australia, the CO and several of the company commanders produced staff studies, lectures and presented papers at the Staff College, the Infantry Centre and elsewhere around the Army. Their key themes stressed the learning the battalion had undertaken and the ways in which their experience had surprised the unit and forced it to adapt. At least one of the battalion COs was fairly sanguine and clearly appreciated the forcing function that their operational experience presented. His perspectives were broadly shared amongst the battalion officers and reinforced the fact that adaptation and learning is frequently confronting and often uncomfortable. I'll fast forward now to the final period of Australian operational experience in South Vietnam. By the latter period of the years of the Vietnam War, the Australian Army had reached a point of doctrinal clarity and professional confidence unmatched in earlier phases of the conflict. Between 1969 and 1971, the period associated with Vietnamisation and pacification, the task force demonstrated an alignment between experience, doctrine and operational requirements that reflected its maturity as a genuine learning organisation. It was during this period of the Army's experiences when formal and informal learning systems and the intellectual engagement of its people converged most effectively. In 1969, the strategic direction for the war changed. Under the policy of Vietnamisation, Brigadier CMI Pearson, the 1st Task Force commander, was instructed to shift 1ATF's mission from major battalion-level search and destroy operations towards pacification, training of South Vietnamese regional and popular forces, and maintaining provincial security in Phuoc Tuy province. This shift aligned more closely with Australian strengths. The requirements that now guided operations, small unit independence, deliberate patrolling, ambushing and population control, were now balanced by a sophisticated understanding of how to employ the suite of combined arms capabilities and in particular US resources present within the theatre that reflected years of accumulated task force experience. Where earlier phases had been marked by doctrinal strain and reactive adaptation, this period showed what adaptation looked like when a force fully understands its operational environment. Perhaps the clearest marker of this maturity was the integration of the task force's formal and informal learning systems. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Kahn, the outgoing CO of the 5 RAR battle group during its second rotation, had undertaken to write detailed letters to his classmate and friend, Lieutenant Colonel Ron Gray, while Gray was preparing 7 RAR for service in Vietnam. These letters provided practical guidance on bunker tactics, mine awareness, interaction with Vietnamese civilians and the regional force and popular force elements, and the local psychology and rhythms of life in Phuoc Tuy. This correspondence became a form of peer-to-peer mentorship, and it reflected the Army's professional culture. Writing later on the value of these lessons, Gray noted that he'd found them so valuable that he insisted that his officers replicate the process for their replacements in 3 RAR as they were preparing for their tour. The 7 RAR Soldiers Field Handbook likewise translated these lessons into compact, experience-based references that were easily accessible by junior leaders of the battle group. Officers' aid memoirs were likewise refined to reflect the theatre's specific needs. Reports formats, orders processes and fire support data, all tailored to meet local conditions. This was matched in 1969 by the establishment of the Army Headquarters Battle Analysis Team. It signalled Army's recognition that tactical lessons must be systematically analysed and disseminated. Training information bulletins, once sporadic and often a reissuing of publications of US publications with an Australian cover sheet, became authoritative vehicles for capturing and institutionalising uniquely Australian combat experiences. With main force Viet Cong activity declining, Australian tactics shifted, this time deliberately rather than reactively. Ambushing, now in very small groups, became a prime leitmotif of how the battle groups operated, and it saw a return to an old concept from the Malayan emergency, the patrol base. These bases allowed dispersed units to operate lightly while maintaining freshness, silence, and a greater degree of responsiveness to emerging intelligence. Unlike previous phases of the war, when unfamiliarity with terrain and enemy capabilities had often made commanders reluctant to break down companies into smaller groups, platoons were now regularly divided into half platoons of 12 to 15 men, providing both autonomy and coverage of a wide area at greater density, plus the ability to concentrate within minutes. By 1969, the task force and battalion headquarters demonstrated a level of combined arms sophistication and an awareness such as fighting in bunker systems that was unmatched in previous years. Battalions had practiced working with tanks during their pre-deployment training, and Khan in particular had arranged for Gray to make use of CMF tanks, tanks at that stage being located in Puckapunyal, not near where 7 RAR was preparing for operations, and had also arranged a demonstration of 5.5-inch medium guns to simulate the types of effects produced by US 155 guns. Similarly, battalion command posts were now tightly integrated with the battalion's fire control centres. Artillery and air support were coordinated seamlessly, and the task force used airborne command posts to maintain oversight of large numbers of widely dispersed small-scale patrols operating across the AO. Their calls for fire were responsive and fast, and their ability to integrate the wide variety of combined arms assets that were available to the task group was unmatched from earlier in the task force's experiences. In many respects, the Vietnamisation period had reached what might be called the professional halcyon days of the Australian armies in Vietnam. Tactical methods, command procedures and training systems were no longer borrowed from other conflicts or adapted under duress. They were the product of Australian experience, Australian reflection and Australian doctrine. This period showed no major doctrinal crises, no sudden innovations forced by operational shock and no need to reconcile competing operational philosophies. Instead, the Army applied lessons already learned, carefully, confidently, and with increasing professional precision. So in conclusion, across this paper, I've outlined how the Army's experience in Vietnam reveals the characteristics of a genuinely professional, learning military organisation. From its doctrinal inheritance through to the early operational friction of 1965-66, to the peak of its operational effectiveness during the Vietnamisation period, the Army demonstrated an enduring capacity to adapt, refine and apply doctrine in ways that reflected both experience and intellectual engagement. 3 key themes stand out. Firstly, operational experience as a driver of doctrinal evolution. The Army's pre-Vietnam experience reflected the accumulated wisdom of earlier campaigns, but Vietnam exposed some of those limitations. The first deployment of 1 RAR demonstrated the axiom that nations go to war with the army that they have, and that doctrine, equipment, organisation and methods can never fully anticipate every operational contingency. When experience revealed gaps, whether in air mobile tactics, tunnel warfare, fire support coordination or patrolling practices, the Army adjusted rapidly. Second, Vietnam revealed that a professional Army learns best when formal and informal systems reinforce one another. Early in the conflict, these systems were misaligned and learning lagged behind events. And finally, and in many ways the most important, this study highlights the role of the individual and the individual's learning, study and professionalism. Doctrine doesn't function in isolation. It lives through the people who interpret it and apply it. This picture shows 5 men, all of whom served together in 3 RAR at the Battle of Kapiong in Korea. The decorations that they wear attest to their experiences. World War II, Korea, Malaya, Borneo and Vietnam. They're representative of the Army of the Vietnam era, and their experiences personify Sir Michael Howard's admonition to study war in its width, depth and context. On the right-hand side is Warrant Officer Reg Bandy. Bandy joined the Army during the Second World War and saw service with the 2nd RAF in the Southwest Pacific and then subsequently with BCOF in Japan. Fought in Korea, trained regular and CMF soldiers at the Jungle Training Centre before serving as an advisor with the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam during his first tour. He subsequently served as an instructor at the Infantry Centre before his appointment as RSM 7 RAR during 7 RAR's second tour in 1969-70. He partnered with this man, Lieutenant Colonel Ron Gray, of whom we've already heard much. So it is perhaps appropriate that a paper on Army professionalism in the Vietnam War ends with a quote from Gray to the men of 7 RAR while preparing for their service in South Vietnam. The Australian Army's experiences in Vietnam remains a powerful case study of how a military organisation learns through formal and informal systems, through operational necessity, and through disciplined, thoughtful professionalism of its people. Thank you. I'd love to take your questions.
Thanks very much, Rich. It reminds me of one of my favourite books from the Australian Army series, The Search for Tactical Success in Vietnam. It was a book that I gave to all of our incoming OCs when I was a commanding officer. That book itself has a number of lessons about what you spoke of, but also that are incredibly valuable today. So with that said, might hand over for first question.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. We've got just the 2 questions in right now, so please get them coming through. The first one to you, Dr. Chadwick. There have been conversations in the US Army today looking into revisiting the pentomic concept in light of the Ukraine war experience of the combat employment of UAVs and drones, which require force dispersion as part of manoeuvre. What do you think about a similar re-examination of the pentropic concept in the Australian Army updated for today's tactical and operational realities? Would current and emerging technologies and doctrine make an updated pentomic or pentropic concept more workable today and into the future?
I don't want to answer that. Look, that's a really difficult thing which I'm not qualified to answer at this stage, right? Because that's where I think you as professionals in uniforms are more suited to answer than me as a historian. I'd be careful. There's a reason why over centuries we've had this structure. It's been tested, it's been tried, and it's been proved to work. I don't think it's necessarily an idea to change it again. It caused massive problems in the Australian Army. It caused massive problems in the US Army. In fact, the US Army didn't completely change over anyway. So they abandoned it long before we started with it. So the pentomic system was reactionary, I think, to the whole concept of what a future battlefield was going to look like, which was going to be people running around with tactical nuclear weapons. And let's face it, I think only the French were the ones who put a bomb on the tank to run around a battlefield, which was a pretty reckless kind of thing to do. So where we looked at it as being for a Southeast Asian environment, the Americans were really looking at as being, this is for stopping a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, knowing that they could not be able to offset the manpower size of the communist forces. So, yeah, I think the thing about this is that, yes, explore all avenues, absolutely. Don't reject anything. It's a standard process of any brainstorming thinking is all ideas are good ideas. Just some ideas are slightly better than others. So don't throw it out, explore it, analyse it, and see and think about how it would impact. It might work. I wouldn't say, I'm not going to throw it out entirely, but I would urge caution that we'll see. If the Americans do it, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to do it, though it does impact a lot of how we think and do things. There's no doubt about that, because we work very closely with them. So I think I'd let them do all the groundwork. They've got more money.
I actually wrote a note during a lecture that sort of said the pentropic division is a warning about adapting for future war concepts that are intellectually fashionable but operationally irrelevant for Australia's geography, our middle power commitments and our limited budget. I think it's a timely reminder for the adaptation that many armies are doing at the moment in regards to remote autonomous systems. And there's definitely some valuable lessons to pull across. It's not suggesting we shouldn't, but it's also suggesting caution. All right, thank you. That was a great question.
Thank you. Our second question is for Lieutenant Colonel Carroll. In your opinion, and from what you know of all that's happened since 2000, can you expand on the cost to Army and the nation of scrapping the military strategy specialisation?
When we went through, Opera actually determined that they thought that there would be 4 viable specialisations, and that was based on the work done by that additional major that I mentioned. All of that was then handed over to the career streaming team, and we had to refine it. There was little guidance on how we should do that, so we basically created it ourselves. Much of the work was done at 04 and 05 level, and we started with Mil-Purse because that was the largest of the 4 envisaged specialisations. And so, although it was the largest, we thought it was the most intuitively sensible. So we worked on that one first. And the process was, after the initial identification by the guy who did the grounding work, We then scrutinised his work, and working with workforce planning, we had them, the expert team process that I described, got a lot of then experts in Army workforce planning and manning and career management into a room, and we literally worked through those lists of positions. And in the process of doing that, worked out that we need the categories construct to be able to delineate them. There was also some work done by the then Major Linda Reynolds, who did some really good survey analysis of people who at that time were doing HR-related jobs. And Linda was an Army qualified training development officer as well, and knew what she was doing. So we went through that process for Milperse. We did the same thing for capability and acquisition, and then we did the same thing for Milstrat and policy. And the responsibility or the delegation for making the decision on what was in and what was out rested with the DOCM. One of the problems with the execution of the program was, and this is what I was getting at when I spoke to initiatives that begin under one officer and invariably they'll finish with another, sometimes many removed. I think we were up to about our fourth DOCM before we were finished that particular program. Two had left unexpectedly. One therefore came into the job unexpectedly without any of the background that his two predecessors had, and he didn't share the same views of his predecessors. So he was very particular that there were things in the military strategy and policy specialisation that he didn't want there, and so they were removed. That's the thing that I believe was most unfortunate, because at the same time that we as an army were saying we should do this, the Americans actually did it. It's one of the few times that I can think of that we were actually doing it before they were. They now have an instituted specialisation for military strategy and policy. I think it's called FA 59, look it up. They've also struggled with how it might be used and applied, but they've got it. We unfortunately decided that we would not. So that's how we came to end up with only Milperse, CAPAC. The resource and infrastructure management we consciously gave away. We actually went to the DOCM, we put that through the expert team process as well, and it's the workforce planners who actually said to us, this one isn't big enough to be sustainable. And so we made the recommendation to the DOCM that one should be let go, but we recommended that the other three were necessary and should proceed. I think it's a disappointment that that third one did not happen.
Thank you.
We don't have any more questions online, but if anybody in the audience has a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you.
Thanks, everyone. Rich, this is probably more for you. I'm interested in if you can shed any light on the actual process of how the doctrine was updated. Who actually wrote it? Was it people in theatre? Were there working groups? You spoke about the battle analysis team. We're sort of asking those questions of ourselves at the moment, so I just value any insights.
Look, I'll answer probably in two different ways. I've used the term doctrine to describe a bunch of learning experiences and learning materials. All of those things are doctrine in a way. We often conflate them with the PAM. What I was really talking about in a lot of respects there is not doctrine, it's TTPs. So throughout the entirety of the Vietnam War, you'd see it in a lot of the language that people in theatre and elsewhere were using. They were talking about changes to doctrine, gaps in doctrine, things that weren't adequately described. What they were really talking about were TTPs that they'd developed in theatre. So the doctrine itself didn't change because the Army's doctrine, like any Army's doctrine, was designed to be written for a broad variety of circumstances, for a variety of theatres and a variety of enemies and terrain. What they were pretty good at, and for that reason, they didn't update the Division in Battle series. That stayed the Army's doctrine until the end of the Vietnam commitment, and then sometime in the early to mid-1970s, the MLW series were released. What they were pretty good at were turning around those tactical information bulletins. They're the sorts of things that we would have called probably the shortcast, Army information bulletins. They were good at doing that. All of those documents that I referred to were end of tour reports, unit war diaries, commanding officers all went on the lecture circuit when they got home. There were lots of lectures to the Staff College. There were lots of lectures to the Infantry Centre or the Combined Arms Centres of the time. And then I alluded to it a little bit, but the limitations of time didn't let me get into a lot of it. The preparation of the units got progressively better and better. When I sort of read back on this study, and for those who aren't aware, I wrote that study years and years ago as a much more junior officer, I was struck by the fact that by comparison with my experiences as a company commander and then a senior officer deploying, the systems that the Army put me through were orders of magnitude more sophisticated than some of those systems that I described there. The fact that Ron Gray was ringing his mate in a reserve unit to get them to bring some tanks up the road from Holsworthy, or to get from Parramatta to Holsworthy, in order to give them the experience of operating alongside tanks, is miles less sophisticated than how the Army prepared forces for Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think, on reflection, we should all be very grateful, or officers of our generation should all be very grateful that that system is as good as it was. It reflected an army of a different era and an army of a different scale. But when it came to writing things down and transmitting them, one of the observations I would make is that they are much better, or they were much better at writing those things down. When the DCA spoke this morning about his end of tour report and some of the ripples that it caused throughout the Army, it's one of a very small number of documents of that type that I can recall being written, and certainly written and then talked about around the Army. I was in the session this morning talking about the Army Journal. I think it's a fair observation to say that our Army doesn't have a strong culture of expecting its people to write things professionally. There are some that do, but it's far, far less common than it was in the Army of that period. And in the footnotes of that paper, you'll thumb through the Army Journal, the Infantry Magazine, the Armoured Corps Regiment kind of books from each year, and that's where you find a lot of that stuff where they talk about what they were doing. They were published, talked about, reflected on, digested into learning for the organisation. Often semi-informally, but they're really enlightening reads for the information that they contain.
We might leave it there. We're at time. I do have a reflection on what you were just saying then, Rich. I think a lot of what you mentioned, and although you commented that we were much better prepared going to Afghanistan, I don't know if I agree with that. I think it sounded, the lessons you were referring to sounded very similar to what we went through. I'd agree that that culture of writing afterwards is not as strong. But, for example, that book that I mentioned before, I read that prior to going to Afghanistan as a platoon commander, and especially in the officer corps, there was a culture of, hey, there are lots of good lessons out there, read them before you go. And it reminds me of a comment that a Marine Colonel, Marine Greybeard, said to us when I was with the Americans. He said, the first to go is often the best trained, the second to go is often the best prepared. And his thoughts were then there is a atrophy thereafter. But I think, relevant. Thanks very much for the questions online and in the room. What is clear is that change is constant. Adaptation is needed and that it must be indeed continuous. Not everyone will agree with the change or adaptations at the time, and that's clear. And as our army is continuously adapting at the moment, there is good contest when it comes to ideas. It's often uncomfortable and comes with a cost. And I'd contest that any cost that reduces the debt that the Chief spoke of as we are either transitioning to war or indeed a wartime army is a worthwhile investment. Thanks very much for your time and insights, gentlemen. And just a round of applause for our appreciation.